To get started on this exercise, you should have downloaded the Flower Sketches folder from the Moodle page. Inside of this folder is a variety of different flowers that you can pick and choose from to practice on. Now for this exercise, you only need to use one of the flowers. However, feel free to do this multiple times using a variety of different techniques, but you only need to turn in one once you're finished. To open them up, we can launch Photoshop. Let's go up to File, down to Open, and let's locate the flower that you want to select. In my case, I'm going to do number 4. We'll say Open, and this will give us our starting point for our document. Now, we're not going to be doing any drawing on this document. Instead, we're going to set this document up as a reference photograph. The first thing we need to do is locate your Layers panel, and let's click once on the little lock icon to unlock your background. This will turn it into a regular layer. Next, let's change the size of our document, or the canvas that we're working on, to match the final canvas size that we do want to work on. To do this, go up to Image, down to Canvas Size, and the size of the canvas we want to work on is going to be a 10 by 13 area. Keep in mind, 10 by 13 is relative, so in my case, this image is longer than it is tall. So the width of mine actually needs to be 13 and the height needs to be 10. It's okay if the proportions are going to be off. We'll fix that in a second. We'll say OK to this, and this will expand out the entire area. Now I need to be able to see everything that I'm working on, so I either need to zoom out or have it fit. You can go up to View and let's zoom out, and this way I can see everything I've got. Next, let's rescale our image so that it fills out the area a little bit better. In order to do this, go up to your tool panel and select the Move tool. It's a little double arrow. With it selected, you can go up to Edit, down to Transform, and choose Scale. You can click on the edge now and drag it up until it fills out the area much better. If you want, it can go beyond the borders. I'm primarily going to focus on drawing this flower, so I'm going to get it centered nice within the entire area. And with the Move tool, you can click on it and drag it into place. Finally, to lock in that, you can click the little checkbox at the top. That'll make changes to that adjustment as well. Next, let's go back down to our layer and lock it down. With layer 1 selected, click on the little lock icon. This way I don't accidentally move it or distort it from here. Now, let's create a grid of guidelines that's going to make it easier to visualize where all of the different parts can be drawn on your final illustration. This is really more of a drawing tool. You don't have to do this for all of your illustrations, but it comes in handy if you really want to get some good accuracy on all of your drawings. To create this grid, you can go up to View. Let's go to New Guide Layout. With New Guide Layout turned on and check on Preview, we can now divide this up into different rows and columns. With column checked on, you can add more rows to it, more columns to it. In our case, since ours is divided up into 13 inches wide, I'm going to set mine to be, there we go, 13 columns, so 13 divisions. We can set the number of rows to be 10. You can notice on this one, there's also a gutter. Now, if you do have a number in the gutter, it's going to add a little space in between those. So let's set our gutter to be set to 0. That way it's just a solid line. Once you have it set to be 13 by 10 or 10 by 13, depending on the height and width of your picture, you can see it's now divided into nice little squares that we can work and draw within. If we say OK, we can zoom out. The last thing that I do when I create this is sometimes these guides tend to get in the way. I would like for them to be a little bit more dim. So in order to change the look and feel of the guidelines that we have, let's go up to our Photoshop preferences. On the Mac, it's under Photoshop, Preferences, and locate the Guides, Grids, and Slices. This will allow us to customize the look and feel of our guides, and you can see our guides now are this bright cyan. If you want, you could change it to a different color like magenta, Or even better, you can change the line style to be a broken line. Doing that will make it much, much thinner, and now I can actually see my image without the guides being in the way. With that done, we can say OK. Now before we move on, let's save this up as our reference image. We'll go to File, let's do a Save As. In this case, we're going to save it as a Photoshop document. This will give us all of our layers and also our guidelines, but I'm going to add the REF at the end of it, meaning it's our reference. We'll say Save and say OK to that. With this still open, now let's create our actual drawing document that we'll do our sketch in. To do that, we'll go up to File, let's create a new document. And our new document needs to be the same height and width as our reference photo. In my case, it's going to be 13 inches wide and 10 inches tall. The resolution does need to be set to 300 pixels per inch. Do make sure you're working in inches. And for now, we'll keep our background as white. We'll say Create, and this is the area that we're going to be working in. What I need to do is, you'll see that my new document is inside of a new tab than my reference photograph. I want to be able to see both my reference and my drawing area in the same spot. To do this, we can go up to Window, down to Arrange, and let's do 2 up vertical. This will allow you to see both your reference image and your drawing space side by side. Now right now you've got your reference image on the right-hand side and my drawing space on the left. And if you'd prefer to swap these up, it's really simple to do. All you've got to do is click on the gray area beside the name of it, and when you drag, you can see you can drag it over. I'm going to place it till a blue line appears right at the edge here. There's the little blue line, and when I let go, now it's placed over this way. The other thing I can do is I can scale these from side to side. So I can select my reference image. I'm going to do Command minus to zoom down. And I can click in between here and you can see how my cursor changes. This will allow me to change the size of the work area. So I'm going to make this smaller, just kind of as a reference thing. Place it off to the side. Up to the top. Again, I can zoom in by doing Command and the plus sign to see my image. And I can select my drawing area and do Command minus or Command 0 to see the whole area for this one. Let's create our guidelines on this side that match for this. We can go up to View, down to New Guide Layout. Now it remembered the last guide that we created, which is good. So we want it to be 13 by 10, and we'll say OK to create this. The final thing I want to do is I want to give myself as much drawing room as possible. So I'm going to go over to my toolbox and click on the little arrows to collapse those down. That'll buy me a little bit of extra room. I can do the same with my panels over here. I can click the arrow, that will collapse those down. And so if I need to activate them, all I've got to do is to click on the name of it in order to bring it up. This gives me a little bit more room to sketch and draw. Now let's establish our different layers we're going to be drawing on. I can go over to my Layers panel. Let's click on it to activate that. And I want to change my background color. I don't want to work on a solid white. Instead, I want you to work thinking in terms of tonal values in shades of gray. So we're going to start off on a good mid-tone value. With that background layer selected, let's go over to our Paint Bucket tool. And remember to find the paint bucket, it could be hiding underneath your gradient tool. But with it selected, we can go over to our color picker now. Make sure you've got the foreground color selected here. You can either click on it, or in my case, I'm just going to use my color picker and choose a mid-tone of gray, right about there. One click in the center will fill that in with a solid gray. Next, let's go to our Layers panel and let's create our new layer by clicking on New Layer icon down here. This will give you Layer 1. And I'm going to double click the name of the layer and I'm going to call it the Reference Sketch. Everything that we paint inside of this area is just going to be the reference for our main sketch that we'll add on all the details into later. So to get started, I'm going to go over to my tool panel, select my pencil tool, And with the pencil selected, the brush that I want to use is just a general round brush. And for the most part, I don't need it to be soft at this point, but I can choose one of the pressure sensitive brushes to work with. As far as the color goes, I'm going to set my foreground color by clicking on it to be just a light blue. Now this blue needs to show up on my background, so it needs to be either slightly darker or lighter. I prefer lighter to be able to draw on. Whatever happens, I should be able to see something like this to work with. With that done, the size of the brush really depends on the amount of details that you want to work in. If I'm looking at my reference photo, if I've got a lot of really thin lines, like right here next to the steeple, I wouldn't want to have that drawn off using a thick type brush. I would want to keep it nice and thin. Versus something, if I had a broader leaf, I could get a little bit thicker with that. The main purpose for this reference layer is simply to give you a guide to draw on top of later so that you can add more details. So for this one, I'm going to keep my brush size relatively low, right around 20 or so pixels. It tends to be pretty good. Because it's pressure sensitive, as I start to draw, if I do need a thicker line, I can always hold down pressure and get a little bit thicker to work with that. Now, in order to see where all of the parts on my reference are in relation to where my drawing surface is, the last thing I need to do is turn on my rulers. Go up to View and down to Rulers. Make sure you can see the ruler on both the top and the left-hand side of your screen. We'll do the same thing for the reference image as well. View, Rulers. Now I know exactly where all the coordinates are. So for instance, if I'm looking at this particular steeple right here, this steeple intersects the 1 and 5 inch ruler. So if I had to find it here and start to draw, I can see here's my 5 inch and here's the 1 inch line down here. And all I've got to do is be able to use that as a starting point for the drawing of that particular steeple. Keep in mind, your drawing doesn't have to look picture perfect. You're simply using it as a reference and a starting point. Later on, we can add our own details, your own style, and whatever other parts that you want to for your own rendering. The main thing I do not want you to do is to trace over your drawing. I can tell that something is traced simply because it looks way too perfect, and it tends to lose that illustrative style that we're looking for whenever we do a drawing. Instead, I want you to trust your instincts and start to hone your artistic eye and actually draw off everything that you see using your reference photo and the grid as a working point. From here, once we back out, later on we'll add final details. All right, now that I've got everything set up, I'm going to close out my layers. Got my reference sketch layers selected, maximize the amount of area that I can work on, and let's start drawing. Whenever I do rough sketching like this, I try to get just the major details. For instance, when I draw off a leaf, I'll see the starting point, like where the end of a leaf is, where it falls on my grid, and I'll start drawing from that point and just get the overall outline of that leaf. If I know I've got the basic shape and the position down, everything else will fall into place. Now a couple of times you'll see me grab my eraser tool and I'll go back and fix a certain area, simply because I know if I don't fix it now, it's going to look even more off later. You'll see it especially on this leaf. I'll start to draw it, then go back, and then have to redraw it again. Now I'm always referencing where it is on my grid. If I see that it's off by a little bit, or if it's in a different quadrant, this is where that grid really comes in handy. Now there are some details that I kind of leave up to my own artistic interpretation. You'll see once I start drawing the little steeples right now, those aren't in the exact same spot, but that's okay. These are small details and I know what I'm going for. The last thing you're going to see me draw are some of the minor details. Things like where there's value shifts, or where the center point of these leaves are, or where there's highlights or shadows that I definitely need to pay attention to. That's where I can do it from here. All right, now that we've finished up our rough sketch, we can turn off the visibility of our grid and just use that rough sketch as the basis for all of our drawing. To turn off the visibility of that, go up to View. First make sure Photoshop is selected. Go up to View and select Extras. Command H is a good keyboard shortcut to remember. When you turn off those extras, this will turn off all or hide all of the grid overlines. You can do the same for your reference photo if you want. Again, going up to View and selecting Extras to see just that particular layer. From here, now we can create a new layer that's on top of this and start to draw and refine all of the edges and really start to clean it up. So I'm going to go to my layers panel, and inside of this, let's create one more layer. This is going to be my outline layer. And here's where I want to draw just a basic black outline. I'm not necessarily going for a painterly effect. For me, I just, again, want to keep this as a rough, kind of sketchy type effect. What I don't want to do is affect my reference sketch layer. So with that layer selected, let's also lock it down so that we don't accidentally paint or move or draw on it. And we'll select our outline layer, and here's where we can close that up. Also with this, if you want, you can scale down your reference drawing maybe just a little bit more. But again, you can always hit Command and the plus sign to zoom in to any of the different spots. And this is where we can zoom in and start to work on all the different areas. For instance, for me, I would like to start working on maybe on each of the individual petals, then I'll go back in on top with the individual steeples. The tool that I'm going to use is continuing with my regular pencil. And as far as the brush goes, I'm going to use, again, one of these legacy brushes that has a good dry media. For me, I like playing around with some of these ones with different textures, so you can play around with whatever you feel is best for yours. Just remember, some of these are pressure sensitive and some of these are not. So depending on the style or the look that you're going for, you may want to choose or test out a couple of them. I'm going to start off with my charcoal pencil. Now, since these are going to be outlines, the color of this, I can start off with just basic black, and then from here, I'll go back in on top of that or underneath that and start to fill in all of my shading. At this point, this is where you can really pin down exactly where the edges of your objects are. I'm still not doing any shading. Instead, I simply want to focus on the form of each individual part. Another tip I want to give you is to increase the amount of smoothing of your pen or your brush that you're working with. You can see how these first couple of leaves are very choppy. Now this leaf will start to become very smooth because I increased the smoothing to 80%. All right, now that we've finished our basic outline of the entire design, we can go in and start adding all the tonal values to the different parts of the flower. And this is the fun part. This is where you get to add in the little details and all the highlights and the shadows. Remember, a good illustration has high highlights, those brightest whites, and also really good dark shadows, dark, deep blacks, and everything in between. Now, as far as the technique you use of creating these tonal values, you can paint the solid tones of all the grays, or you can use cross-hatching or stippling for your effect. By the end of this illustration, it shouldn't look like a perfect picture. It should look sketchy, it should look painterly. So whatever you do, give it that good artistic kind of feel, but don't feel like it has to look 100% perfect. As far as the tool that I'm using, I'm still going to use my pencil tool, but I've swapped over to a more textured kind of brush. I really love this soft, large pastel. With this particular brush, it gives me the ability to paint. Let's see if I can load up some black paint here, and pick up a lot of texture and add that texture to my overall design. So that's kind of what I'm looking for my design and style. I'm going to be painting tones, but later on I'll go back and I'll add a few stippling and maybe even some cross-hatching within my overall design. Before I do get started painting, the last thing we need to do is to go to our layers panel, and let's make one more layer below our outline layer. This way I'm not interrupting with my outline, but I'm also still keeping my reference. So I'm going to lock down my outline layer, and let's create another new one. And this layer, we're going to click and drag it below the outline layer. Let's call this our tone layer. So all of our highlights, midtones, and shadows will be placed within here, and the other layers won't be affected with this one. So this will be the layer that we do all of our painting into. From here, it's simply a matter of taking it one part at a time. Again, look closely at your reference, zoom in as you need to, but also make allowances so that it looks nice and painterly once you're finished. Along the way, I'll give you some ideas and some things to think about that you can apply for your particular design. Now, as I work through each individual petal, I'm paying close attention to the rough sketch that's below it. I made some notations where the different highlights and shadows may meet. I call those shadow shapes or highlight shapes. And I tend to like to draw my shadows first, then go back and add my highlights last. The highlights tend to act more like as icing on the cake. I know that if I can define where the darker values are, and especially where the edge of one darker value meets a highlight, then it tends to bring everything together much, much more smoothly. Also keep in mind, my background's already a midtone, so I don't have to focus on those midtones. I can jump right in and do those darker and lighter ones to work with in this. Finally, if I need to make any changes, grab your eraser tool, paint back over it, and clean up everything. And then once you get it tightened up, you can move on. Now that I've roughed in all of my highlights, midtones, and shadows for each individual part of my flower, you can see that it's really taken form. The last thing I want to do to add to my document is a simple background. Now your background certainly doesn't need to be as detailed as your reference photo. Instead, I can think about the design of this and give myself some good contrast that would really make this pop. Right now my background's just a solid mid-tone of gray, so either making it lighter or darker in certain areas will certainly make the entire thing stand out and give the whole composition a little bit more depth. To do this, let's open up our layers panel, and we're going to make one more final layer. That layer is going to be below all of our tones that we've sketched out. So I'm going to select my reference layer, create a new layer on top of this one. I'm going to call it my drawing background. I call it this just to differentiate it between our regular background, which will still be our solid tone. Also, while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and lock down my tone layer so I don't accidentally draw on that, and make sure your drawing background is selected from here. Now with this, I can select my pencil tool, and we'll work with a larger brush simply so I can cover a larger area. You're going to see me play around with either doing lighter or darker, and once I get it all roughed in, I can go back in with my eraser and clean up the overall edges just so I can see what everything looks like. Now, as I'm painting this background, I'm trying to figure out should it be lighter or darker in certain areas. Of course, you can have your background change values. It doesn't have to be one solid color. But if I have my foreground, my actual flower being really light, then I want to have a good background that's dark. In this case, you can see how I'm playing around with the top. I think it really looks good as a lighter background, but the background on the bottom should be a little bit darker, but maybe not so dark. So feel free to paint on it, paint over it, really work in the background, but don't worry about details. Mine's very, very cloud-like. The last thing that I do is grab my eraser tool and go inside of my leaves, and I clean up the edges of my leaves to make sure everything looks really nice. All right, now that I've finished out with the background, the entire painting is finished. The last thing I need to do is to go to my layers panel, and let's turn off our reference sketch just so that we can see everything in black and white. Now from this point, you can always go back and start to add or delete away or alter any details that you need. So for instance, I can see that maybe I need to lighten up some parts of my petals that got a little bit too dark in certain areas. This is where I'll take a little bit of extra time to put in those final details, but for the most part, everything is nice and finished. When you're ready to turn this in, you can go up to File and save your document as a Photoshop file if you haven't done so already. I'll go to File and Save As and remind you. Do make sure your name is on the file so that I know how yours is versus the other students that are in the class. And make sure Format is saved to Photoshop. I want to see all the layers that you have created. When you hit Save, I'll go ahead and save that. You'll upload this to the Moodle page. Now, if the file that you have is too large for Moodle, keep in mind you can either upload it to a Google Drive folder and share that with me, or you can email this copy to me as well. The next step that we're going to do is apply these tools and techniques to a larger scale project.